I'm going to go to my next guest. We have a full show today. I am joined with Piers Robinson. Piers Robinson. He is co-director of the Organization for Propaganda Studies. You can follow him on Twitter at Piers Robinson1. I follow your channel. I always appreciate your take. Welcome to the show, man. How you doing today?
Hi, it's good to be with you. Hope you're well.
I am doing well, and it is good to have you. And thank you for coming on short notice. My guest he was injured. He wasn't able to come on. And so I really do appreciate it. And I was following, it sounded like, and correct me if I'm getting this wrong, you and another gentleman were doing a presentation on how the fake chemical weapon strike that they kept saying took place in Syria led to what we're seeing now in Syria with this Jilani jihadist government taking over, the ethnic cleansing that the West is flagrantly ignoring. Like all of this stuff, meaning the outcome of Syria right now is directly related to this false flag chemical weapon strike on Syria. Am I getting that right? I want to make sure I understand the presentation.
Yeah.
Please do the presentation so the audience will be able to find it.
For sure. I mean, it's not one specific chemical weapons allegation. It's the entire narrative that was constructed around alleged chemical weapons used by the Syrian government. Yeah. And that narrative, as I've argued for many years, has formed essentially a strategic deception, propaganda drive, and it has been designed from the beginning in order to delegitimate the Syrian government, to shore up, for example, sanctions, to shore up support for the military operations to overthrow the Syrian government. Very similar in a way to what we saw with Iraq and WMD with Saddam Hussein back in 2003. That was, as we know now, it was a false narrative. It was manipulated intelligence, painted Saddam as being involved in the current production of chemical and biological and nuclear weapons, etc., used to justify the war. And this is exactly what happened in Syria, and it kicked off very early on in Syria in 2012 with these events occurring, which were being blamed on the Syrian government. And they maintained this for many, many years with multiple alleged attacks. We can get into the details in a minute. But essentially what that was designed to do was to demonize and to delegitimate the Syrian government and to underpin essentially the regime change war which was going on and which led to where we are now, because in December of 2024, the 14-year dirty war against Syria finally succeeded and the Syrian government fell and Jilani took over, Jilani and HTS, and Jilani is somebody who's been backed by the West. His career has segued from Al-Qaeda in Iraq through to Al-Qaeda al-Nusra Front in Syria, and he's now in charge.
Yep.
With, as you just described, accompanying atrocities being committed now against yellow whites and other groups within the country. So although in the first instance it might seem sort of, well, what is Piers getting at here? What chemical weapon attack is he talking about? But really, when you look at the big picture with Syria, the chemical weapons deception, it has been a major part of the propaganda drive. Because if you remember back in 2024, when the Syrian government fell, the rhetoric was there. We've got rid of Assad finally. This is a man who gasses his own people. Right. So it's important, it's powerful, and it's enabled what it is helped create the path to where we are now in Syria, with the country torn apart, obviously with Turkey and Israel occupying parts of the country, with the atrocities being carried out with groups connected to the current Syrian regime, which is in control, and with an incredibly uncertain future. In a broader context of the Middle East, where there is an incredibly uncertain future at this point in time. So that's what I meant by that. And it has been important. I know that with the Iraq invasion, it was very much upfront that it was the weapons of mass destruction was the core argument being put forward. And of course, with Syria, there's always been sort of a range of arguments pushed forward. But the chemical weapons narrative was one of them, and a very important part of that. So it's gotten us to where we are today. If it hadn't have been there, it would have been much harder to pursue the dirty war against Syria.
Oh, I 1,000% agree with you. I remember when Tulsi Gabbard went on CNN. She went on CNN after taking a trip to Syria. And one of the arguments was, oh my God, he gasses his own people. How are you visiting Syria? Meaning for her pointing out, we're supporting terrorists in Syria to try to overthrow the government. They were like, yeah, but Assad gasses his own people. So it's okay. Like, meaning,
Undercuts the argument.
yeah, it
Pulls
was
the rug
used as a
out from you.
justification
Yeah.
for anything that happened in Syria to Assad, missing the point that, they're human beings in Syria beyond Assad, that they're allowing this to take place. And people like me, I would imagine people like you, people who have been paying attention to this issue, pointed out whatever you think of Assad, when he goes, those jihadists are going to go on a murder campaign. And that is exactly what happened. The West tried to make it look as if, well, Jelani, this head chopper that used to be with ISIS, is now in a suit. He had a haircut. And so he's perfectly fine. I mean, he's going to European capitals, shaking hands with these various people. Well, he didn't shake Baerbock's hand, but you get my point. And if I'm not mistaken, is even meeting Donald Trump. Like they're effectively putting him out in the media as if this is some great guy who is now bringing Syria together. Syria is being balkanized, correct?
Yeah, it's being balkanized. As I mentioned, you have Israel and Turkey occupying, and also on the cusp of fighting over territory within Syria.
Yeah.
You have Jelani and his crew in control of part of Syria. I can't quite. I've been traveling for a little bit, so I'm not quite sure if America has pulled its troops out of the eastern parts of Syria. I suspect probably not. So the country is carved up. There is a terrifying future, I think, at the moment. I mean, if you remember what happened after the Iraq invasion in 2003, if you remember the civil wars which raged, which, of course, interestingly enough, Jelani was a part of, in terms of being Al-Qaeda in Iraq, it's looking as a very desperate future, I think. And again, in the broader context of the wars which are going on. So, yeah, and I was going to say, just to make the point clearly, I mean, the point about the chemical weapons, that this has been a highly organized deception operation with the involvement of multiple countries, Britain, France, and America, Qatar, Israel, Turkey, involved in some real events, as in false flag, other completely fabricated events, the manipulation of organizations such as the OPCW, that's the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and the manipulation of those investigations to point the finger at the Syrian government. And it involved the use of proxies, for example, former British military people involved with groups such as the White Helmets on the ground have been involved in the construction of this deception over chemical weapons. Back to the OPCW, you had the Duma investigation in 2018. You had whistleblowers from that investigation finally, as it were, blew the whistle that those investigations were being corrupted in order to point the finger at the Syrian government. So you have an extraordinarily large network of these contractors, former defense, governments working, corrupting the OPCW fact-finding missions in order to maintain this oppression that Assad was gassing his own people. And some of these events, okay, I said some were staged, some were real false flags, as it were. Some of these events involved the murder of civilians. Okay, certainly Ghouta 2013 is the most prominent. Duma, there were 43 civilians killed. So just think about for a second what one actually means when one says that these events weren't carried out by the Syrian government. They were carried out by someone else under our noses or with our involvement. This is the murder of civilians. This is war crimes which are being committed. And the drive is to blame all of this on the Syrian government, blame all of this on Assad and so on, when in reality, what we know from people such as myself and others who've researched this for many years, and also because of the whistleblowers who emerged, this is all false. These deceptions have been created, and some of them have included the murder of civilians. This is a war crime. And myself, I worked alongside Hans von Sponeck and Jose Bastani, who's the first Director General of the OPCW, and also Richard Falk. We've spent many years communicating with the UN Security Council, communicating with the OPCW, communicating with the International Commission on Syria, about the manipulation of the Duma investigation. And guess what? They don't want to hear, and they don't want to talk about it.
That's what
And
I was
most
going to ask
importantly,
you.
they don't want to deal with any of the questions which were raised by the whistleblowers. And it's that silence, I think, which speaks volumes about their guilt and culpability in what has transpired in Syria over the last 13, 14 years.
That is precisely what I was going to ask you, because I saw it was like 3 different whistleblowers. They talk about
There were
putting out
two primary whistleblowers, but there were other people who communicated with us. But essentially, there are 2 publicly known whistleblowers, Ian Henderson and Brendan Whelan. But there are other people who communicated with us in the OPCW, but they were the ones who became the public face, in a sense.
That is so wild to me, because they put out their own report, making the point of saying the report was changed. They talk about how men coming in seeming like Americans, effectively, I don't want to say threatening, but effectively threatening and trying to push them to change the results of their report. The first report points out that canisters were just sitting in a way that they couldn't have been dropped. And, it was chlorine. Like, the report completely repudiates what was put out by the OPCW ultimately. And them coming out saying, look, we were the investigators. That report is bogus. And the UN Security Council is like, we don't want to hear it. We don't care. That is an astonishing thing. Yeah, I don't know how to reconcile that. I mean, and what I mean by not being
You
able to
dropped out
reconcile
for a minute there. I got cut off for a minute, so I missed the first part. But I assume you were talking about the whistleblowers.
Exactly. And what they were coming out effectively saying that the whistleblowers, my point is, the whistleblowers came out and completely repudiated the report that came out saying we were the investigators. That is not our report. And the things that you're saying in that report is not the assessments that we came to. And the UN Security Council blows off the people who are actually doing the investigation and goes with a report that they themselves say is not the report that we released. Yeah. That is amazing.
It was an amazing event. I mean, this is all sort of was at its height around 2019, when OPCW whistleblowers first emerged. But there were documents was leaked to WikiLeaks, for example. The British journalist Peter Hitchens reported on the issue, and to make absolutely clear what actually happened was that the team who went to Duma to investigate, they wrote up their first report, okay, and submitted it off, and it was signed off. Right, that's going to be published, and it was Brendan Whelan, the guy who'd been involved in who'd written the first report. He by accident discovered at the printers the report which was about to be published, and it wasn't the report he had written. It had been profoundly altered and manipulated and so on. And the only reason why it wasn't published is because he happened to just catch it at the printers by accident and said, well, this isn't right. And he then protested internally and so on. And that was the start of essentially the kind of internal controversy over what was going on with the investigation, which ultimately became public. But when you think about it, that's absolutely extraordinary. You have a scientific team, they write their report, and this is all within the auspices of the OPCW, supposedly the gold standard chemical weapons watchdog, connected.
Independent.
It's a UN-linked organization.
Yeah, independent watchdog, by the way.
Independent watchdog. And that is blatant and obvious scientific corruption of an investigation, and that's known, and it's never been even questioned. It's never been disputed because it's true, because the documents were leaked, because Brendan Whelan's letters of protest were released, and his letters to the Director General of the OPCW, and and the second part of this is that. Think about it, if you're part of a big company, or if you're on a university and you have a research team where something like this happens, and the researchers come to you and you're the dean of the university or you're in charge of the organization, say, this is what's happened. What would you do? You would immediately, if you were if you were going to act appropriately, you would immediately conduct an investigation and find out what on earth was going on within your organization. And the Director General of the OPCW, the response was to stonewall the scientists, and then ultimately, along with the British, French, and American governments, start to smear and attack the scientists. So it's extraordinary, and it's absolutely blatant And for anyone who wants to take the time to sort of read the reports that I've written and research other people have done, Aaron Matei has done a lot of work with the Grey Zone on this. And there's many other researchers over the years who've looked at other chemical weapons incidents. It doesn't take long looking at us to see how blatant the manipulations are, and the OPCW's behavior with the whistleblower scientists was blatant, and they've gotten away with it. And of course, they've gotten away with it for all the usual reasons: highly compliant mainstream media who don't want to touch the issue, governments who are willing to engage in smear campaigns against anybody who raises questions. So myself and my colleagues working on Syria have been hit multiple times by hit pieces in the Times or the Huffington Post, and that closes the issue down. And of course, these issues do never get completely closed down, and in the fullness of time, the truth comes out, and I think that will be the case with Syria. But it's just yet another example. We have a large swathe now. We're living through a time, aren't we, where things which were previously not known become known. Yesterday's conspiracy theory is today's fact, etc. Syria and the chemical weapons is one of those, but it's a big one. It's a 13-year war. And the manipulation and the corruption is obvious if you care to look, if people dig into it, and it is blatant, and it is just another example, I think, in the broader sense of how corrupt our governments are and our mainstream media, but also the extent to which deception is such an integral part to the way in which our democracies operate. Publics are continually being deceived. Iraqi WMD, Syria chemical weapons, 9/11, JFK assassinations, all of these issues, which, of course, Ukraine, Nord Stream is I think, in a way, a lot of people know about Nord Stream now. That, by the way, it wasn't the Russians who blew up Nord Stream pipeline, and so on. But that one was almost too obvious for them to. It was
comical, yeah.
They couldn't even try for much longer than a year to keep that one buried. Yeah. But that's when it was carried out, it was yet another major deception. And so on. We're living through this kind of era. But Syria, as I say, is a big one, an important one, and one that we have a lot of knowledge about. I mean, I won't sort of go into the details of some of the incidents, but people who've researched, whether it's Ghouta 2013, for example, some of the early alleged chlorine attacks, some of it is very obvious, and some of it is unfortunately comical, the level of deception or the kind of deception which is being employed. And so, I mean, I'll give one example on Talmenis. I mean, I think you've got time, haven't you?
Yeah, time.
I mean, Talmenis is one of the first of the alleged chlorine gas attacks, when, after the Syrian government had acceded to the Chemical Weapons Convention, handed over all of its strategic arsenal of sarin, which it used essentially as a strategic defense potentially against Israel, who are nuclear capable. After it had basically sort of it had joined the Chemical Weapons Convention, it had dismantled all of its strategic stocks. And I guess Assad and Syria were thinking, well, hopefully that's all over now, when they're going to stop accusing us, and so on. But then suddenly chlorine gas cylinders apparently started to be dropped on the civilian population. And so, what we're being asked to believe there from the narrative managers in the West is that having sort of dismantled and given up his strategic arsenal of sarin, Assad suddenly decided, well, I'm just going to carry on and start dropping chlorine gas cylinders on the population. Now, the first one of these was Talmenis, and that was to be investigated by the OPCW and their newly formed fact-finding mission, which was an ad hoc mission. It's not part and parcel of the OPCW. It was set up essentially outside of the framework of the Chemical Weapons Convention at the behest of the Americans and the British to investigate these new allegations. And this is back in 2014. Mm-hmm. And what transpired with Talmenis is that there were two attack sites which were claimed at the time. The chlorine gas cylinder has landed here, and then 90 meters over there, another chlorine gas cylinder has landed. Please come in and investigate. And now, after sort of multiple reports, and all of this is buried in this rather tortuous process of interim reports and then a joint investigative mechanism, what they finally conceded is that one of these impact sites, where there's this huge crater, where supposedly a chlorine gas cylinder had fallen, a huge crater surrounded by dead animals who were unmarked and so on. The team concluded, well, that appears to have been created by an explosive device put into the ground, which has created this crater and so on. And so this is a stage scene. But the other scene 90 meters away, where there's another chlorine gas cylinder, and there's a partially demolished kitchen, and where somebody is reported to have been killed, we'll take that one as real. We think that that's enough evidence to say that's a real attack. So that's what comes out at the end of this investigation, is that, okay, one of these sites is staged and the other site is real. But these were both reported at the time by these activist groups on the ground as being part of the same attack. So if the final report is correct and that one of these is real and one of these is staged, what we are being asked to believe is that as a real chemical weapons attack was occurring at Talmenis, 90 meters away at another location, somebody was busily blowing up dynamite in the ground to create a crater, and then surrounding it with dead animals to create a stage scene. It's absurd.
That's outrageous.
And yet that is the kind of absurdity that has been communicated. And, other investigations, you've got equally absurd arguments being put forward. By 2016, and I won't name the names as to who we think was behind this, not publicly, but this kind of narrative emerges that Assad had started to not just use a cylinder of chlorine gas to drop on the civilian population, that he'd started to use this new mixed device or binary device, whereby you combine, I think, hydrochloric acid with explosives and then potassium permanganate. And you create, essentially, when this thing hits the ground, an explosion occurs and it creates a chemical reaction which creates chlorine, because a byproduct of mixing these things is chlorine. Okay. And so they have these pictures of this bizarre kind of sort of wacky racist type device with these packages of hydrochloric acid inside, with these packages of potassium permanganate, and then these explosive detonator cords. Totally infeasible device, which no weapons expert would seriously say that this would actually work in practice. And then again, just think about it for a second. This device, even if it could create a little bit of chlorine through the reaction, it would, as a colleague pointed out to be about enough chlorine to kill a field mouse, possibly. It creates a very small amount. So if you're going to be dropping cylinders, why don't you just drop a cylinder of chlorine?
Right. That would be more simple, right?
It makes no sense. It's just part of this crude propaganda and sort of anything we can get away with and so on, because the mainstream journalists, unkind reading, they're just stupid. A kind reading is that they're just co-opted and they're not allowed to report on this, or they're not allowed to use their own minds when looking at these cases. This kind of nonsense gets passed off, and it ends up, for example, that binary device ended up in an OPCW FFM report. Here's a possible drawing of the kind of weapons which we think Assad might be using. It's crazy.
Give me your take on the journalist aspect. I mean, and I guess there are two, right? One is the OPCW itself. And how do you think they were manipulated? Was that a complicit head of the OPC that just accepted the U.S. saying, hey, Assad is responsible, so we're going to push the report in a particular direction? And the other one is the media. I am always at a loss to know whether they're incompetent or whether they're complicit. I don't know which. I've been in media as a reporter, and I still don't know which. Because from my point of view, and I may be crude in the way I get stories, but I just say, okay, I'm sitting on the moon looking at events. This is my understanding of what I'm seeing. And I try to be as honest as possible. They come away with ludicrous ideas, like the notion that the OPCW report is in conflict, meaning there are people coming out, going after the report. They ignore one, report the other, without presenting the alternative of saying, hey, the people who actually investigated are saying this report is bogus and manipulated. Okay, well, people can come to their assessment that, well, yeah, reports can be manipulated. And so the people who are doing an investigation are not necessarily wrong in this? What would be their motivation in this? But the reporter ignore that and repeat the narrative. And I'll give you one other before I let you comment. I remember Syria, Russia, Iran had taken back roughly 80% of the territory. And they still came out with the narrative Assad is using chemical weapons. And it's like, okay, well, why would he need to do that, considering they've taken back the overwhelming majority of the territory? The Russians and Iranians are helping. They can obviously take back the rest. Why would they need to do that? And the media would say, well, it's because Assad is a bad guy. And it's like, okay, so you're telling me that despite the fact that releasing the chemical weapons is a pretext by which the West may get further involved into the war, that he's doing this without needing to do it just because he's a bad guy. And they say yes. And it's like, okay. Like, that's what I mean, right? Like, are they that in the tank where it's just this American or Western perspective where they're just blind to this stuff?
Well,
Where
they're blind.
So you don't think they're lying? You think they're just blinded by
Well,
the
okay.
narrative?
Picking up on the 2 points in a second, both about how this was working within the OPCW and the question of journalism. Why do they do what they do? I mean, the Ghouta 2013 mass sarin attack, which was blamed on the Syrian government, that occurred in Damascus a week after an OPCW UN team had arrived to investigate allegations of chemical weapons use by the opposition. So the Syrian government had invited in the OPCW and the UN, said, please come, because our soldiers are being attacked with sarin. Right. And a week after they arrived in Damascus, there was this mass sarin attack, and it was blamed on the Syrian government, and that led to the accession, which I was talking about earlier. Yes. But what we're asked to believe there is that Assad, having invited in an investigation team, then decided, okay, I'm just going to fire off a salvo of sarin right into a Damascus just so they can actually see the rockets going. It makes no sense. And as you say, journalists aren't using their critical faculties and so on.
Yeah.
Look, just very quickly, we know quite a lot about what has been going on within the OPCW. And for example, one of the problems I mentioned before was that the fact-finding missions were operating outside of the Chemical Weapons Convention. And one of the consequences of that was that the scientific divisions in the OPCW had no oversight of those investigations. They were controlled from what's called the Office of the Director General, which is where the Director General is, and then the Chief of Cabinet. And if you look at the staff personnel in those positions, it was a Turkish Director General and a Spanish Director General during Duma. You had a British career diplomat who was Chief of Cabinet, Bob Fairweather, during the Duma investigation. And you had Sebastian Brahard take over, who was a French career diplomat. And there you can just start to see the problems of bias. There you have investigations being controlled not by the scientific divisions, but by the Office of the Director General, which in turn is staffed to an extent or in part by career diplomats from countries who are actually belligerents in the war against Syria. And so that starts to create the kind of mechanisms by which influence can work. I could go into more details in terms of what is known about the level of penetration, but we'll leave that for now on just giving your audience a little bit of a sense of why these investigations became corrupted and so on. It's partly an organizational issue there, but there's also an issue of personnel being inserted at various points and so on, which I don't have time to go into detail. But coming to the media, why do journalists do this? I mean, you know, there's a big literature on this, and I think, you know, we probably discussed this before, big literature in the political communication scholarship, work by people, famously by Herman Chomsky, Ed Herman and Noam Chomsky, but also many others, who talk about how the mass media operate in a democracy. And, you know, there are multiple sort of filters or constraints on journalists, ranging from sort of the crossover and interest between big media conglomerates and government interests. There's also the way in which journalists go about their job of using or relying too much on official sources when constructing the news. But then there are ideological constraints. And then there's also the flak filter. You know, when you do, as a journalist, start to push back against power in a significant way, you get hit hard. And you get smeared, as does anyone else who pushes back against official narratives. And what that means is that you have a system which is essentially reinforced through a number of filters, which mean that a lot of journalists just they just learn how to behave. And most of the time, that's the official story. I'm not going to go there because if I go there, I'm going to get into trouble. And it's much more comfortable space to remain, okay, I'll stay within the contours of the official narrative and so on. And then, my career won't be problematic. I'll get promoted and so on. All of those things going on, which mean, some journalists know full well what they're doing. Okay, they know that sort of I'll turn a blind eye to that because I don't want my career damaged. Other journalists have just internalized the narrative and they believe it. And this probably happens with people within governments and foreign policy communities as well, and because they're subjected to internal propaganda. So they end up believing these things. And it's just, I guess, in a way, too much hard work to have to sit there and think, well, maybe my government isn't telling me the truth. Maybe if I look more closely at this issue, I'll realize that everything is not as we are being told. But that takes, a combination of effort and a little bit of courage, a little bit of stamina as well, in order to do that. So, I think all of that works together. But I think it does vary from journalist to journalist, right? Some journalists are just completely duped. Others know what side their bread is buttered on and so on and don't want to go there. The few who do go there get attacked. Peter Hitchens reported in the OPCW, he was smeared and attacked by fellow journalists and so on. The final thing I would add is that intelligence services have a presence in the mainstream media. We know from the church hearings in the 70s in America, the CIA and American mainstream media. Well, guess what? That didn't all come to an end after the church hearings in the 1970s when that was revealed. It was known, several hundred journalists were connected to the CIA, and that's what came out in the 70s. That hasn't stopped, and you do have some journalists out there who appear to be journalists, but are probably wearing, they've got a couple of hats in their bag, and they have one foot in the intelligence services and one foot in the mainstream media. And I think they often play quite a key role in agenda setting on issues. So you have that going on as well as all of the more traditional sort of sociological kind of explanations of mass media, how journalists operate, how they get on in their careers, and the kind of pressures which act upon them. Number of things.
Piers, man, thank you for this. Great breakdown. I swear, really good breakdown of this. I when I saw the story and I saw the thing, I was like, okay, this is a really interesting topic. And as you point out, it has been used to fundamentally destroy Syria. Just like this propaganda setting a context by which this could take place over the course of multiple years. So thank you for this breakdown. Piers Robinson, he is co-director of the Organization for Propaganda Studies. You can follow him on Twitter at Piers Robinson1. Is there somewhere else where people can find you, by the way?
I'm editor of Propaganda and Focus, and so we have a lot of public articles there. I'm also research director at the International Center for 9/11 Justice. People can find me on that website. But those are the main ones, and I have a Substack as well. But most of my sort of work that I'm involved with in organizations are there on my Twitter handle. So, X handle. I'm still using the old phrase.
I still use Twitter too. Yeah, I said the same thing. It's like, this is going to be Twitter forever. Pluto is a planet.
For me too.
So Piers, man, thank you for that. I really appreciate it. You have a good one. Be safe, okay?
Yeah, good talking to you.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right. We have had a really good show